Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Tim McInnes. I'm the Managing Director of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, a nonprofit, government-registered, and government-partnered crime victims assistance and crime prevention NGO based in Miami, Florida, incorporated in the state of Florida. I'm standing in as guest host today for Debbie Montgomery Johnson, who is out traveling the world. Today she's in Hawaii, so we wish her a big aloha. And I have with me today my guest, Mr. PJ Rohal, who is the founder or co-founder of an organization called About Fraud, which is about-fraud.com. And he is one of the world's leading experts in all forms of consumer and financial fraud, particularly commerce fraud, financial industry fraud, etc. So I'd like to welcome PJ.
I am here loud and clear. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. As Tim said, my name is PJ Rohal. So I have a couple different roles. I co-founded About Fraud. We'll start there, which is basically a global community for fraud fighters, so people who work in fraud prevention and risk prevention related roles. I also am a fraud SME with a technology company called FeatureSpace, which helps stop fraud for financial institutions, payment processors, merchant acquirers. So I've been in the industry about 10 years, which is long for some, but there's some that have been in here 20, 30 years. It's a niche industry. And I love educating people on fraud prevention. I love learning from others and just trying to become smarter about something that is continually evolving, a challenge for businesses, which is a big part of our focus, but also for their consumers, because they're the ones that are, in the end, being impacted by this fraud. So I know we have a variety of topics we're going to discuss today. Hopefully I can be informative and helpful, and I'm happy to join.
Excellent. Thank you, PJ. So perhaps we can begin by, talking about some things that affect nearly everyone. One of the topics that both I and Brett Johnson, who was on one of your recent podcasts, who is an advisor to SCARS, scoundrel though he is and very likable guy, and very happy that he's on our side of the fence now and not on the dark side, has been this thing called account takeover fraud. Maybe you can explain a little bit about what that is and what it means for consumers.
Sure. And Brett is a good guy, and what he's done as far as moving from being a fraudster over to helping people is no small feat. I just wanted to put that out there. So, yeah, account takeover fraud is basically when somebody gets your sensitive personal identifiable information, PII, and takes over your account, gains access to it to do a number of things. It could be to steal information. It could be to execute a payment. And it depends on the account. So you can take over lots of accounts. It could be a financial bank account. It could be an account that you have with a merchant like Amazon, not calling them out, just any type of merchant basically. And there's lots of benefit for someone to do this. If they're stealing information, that's as good as money these days, because you can use it to take over other accounts, or if you're stealing payment information, make unauthorized purchases. If you're taking over a bank account to execute a payment out of that account, then the financial benefit there is obvious to most. So that is the basics of account takeover, or ATO. How do people get this information? There are large-scale data breaches where people can purchase this information on the dark web, but it's also done through social engineering, which Brett, I'm sure, talked plenty about, where people manipulate others into giving up this information. And that is a particularly nefarious form of scamming. And Tim, I know you guys talk plenty about scamming, manipulating others psychologically, emotionally, to give up information or to make a payment out of their account. That is, I would say, some of the more dangerous areas of account takeovers and scamming. because you're not only stealing someone's information, but you're manipulating them psychologically. And there's financial losses, but there's also psychological damage that can come from that. So there's a lot of different directions we can go with ATO, but that's kind of a general overview.
Thank you. And of course, in the world of scams in general, we know that the various forms of phishing scams, whether it be email or by other means, messaging, text, etc., has become an explosion over the last 24 months, especially because of the pandemic. We also see, and in fact saw something quite significant this week, when Europol announced the results of its sort of annual sweep of money mules, where they arrested about 1,800 money mules, identified about 18,000 money mules under watch now. And in the U.S., we typically see similar sweeps going on here. In the case of scam victims, one of the things that is common, it's not a majority by any means, but it is sufficiently common that it's double-digit percentages, are victims who become involved in one scam or another, commonly romance scams, but it can also be lotto scams. It can be any flavor of different kinds of financial deception where the victim will end up volunteering information about their financial accounts, in many cases even giving access. What do you see as the magnitudes, numbers, both in terms of individuals, dollar amounts, etc., and perhaps talk about some of the precautions that can be taken to help prevent ATOs?
I like to separate ATOs from authorized push payment fraud, which is when somebody manipulates you into actually logging in yourself and sending the money out of your account, where an account takeover is they're the ones doing it, but they can still manipulate you and scam you for your information. So
right.
Both are rising very quickly. What's driving a lot of it is faster payments and more real-time payment systems where once that money's sent out of the account, whether it's an account takeover or an authorized push payment fraud, it's immediately available and they can move that money around a bunch of times. You mentioned money mules. That's one way to kind of launder those funds and kind of disguise where they came from. So that's driving both types up a lot. I think when things like the pandemic happen, and it's not just a pandemic, but any way that they can prey on people's emotional vulnerabilities, psychological vulnerabilities, which we all have. It's not just older people. It's not just less tech-savvy people. It's people in general who have a human brain and emotions, which is everybody.
Yep.
That makes the scamming and the authorized push payment fraud more levers to pull. So if you're in a pandemic and you're having hard financial times, or you're looking for vaccines or health updates and things where they can get you to act quickly, not think before kind of clicking on things, then that's a breeding ground for scams. And that's exactly what the pandemic has created. But it happens in any situation where there's unrest and people's kind of are emotionally triggered by things. So you mentioned romance scams. Those have been around for a while. Having social media and the ability to connect with people through that has, allowed that to probably be a little bit more amplified. But there's all different types. There's investment scams. There's with crypto rising and people getting excited about investing in crypto, but maybe not really sure what they're doing. They're clicking on things to invest in crypto. There's business email compromise, which is more of your commercial, where somebody who's in charge of the accounts payable is scammed and tricked into sending money for an invoice or something where their boss is saying, hey, I need you to pay this invoice, and it's not actually from their email. It's been compromised.
Right.
So there's all different types of levers and you can pull. And I think just to drill back to your question, they're all rising very quickly, whether it's the amount of information we have available for account takeovers, whether it's the just the nature of human beings, and there's lots of crazy emotional things going on. Pandemic, one of them, being good levers to pull to scam people. And I think that the challenging thing on the financial side is getting good hard stats around this. So as you know, people who go through scams are not as likely to report it. They feel ashamed, and that's part of the psychological damage and the challenges. So they're very underreported. So there's a lot more out there that is actually reported. And from a business standpoint, banks and other companies have trouble catching these. They're very difficult. So they're not caught, tracked, labeled, and reported on. So
a question with regard to that.
Sure.
Do financial institutions in the United States have an obligation to report to law enforcement when they're notified of fraud?
There's obligations with certain types of fraud and money laundering. I don't know specifically when and exactly when they have to do it, when they're required to it, especially from a money laundering standpoint. There's compliance for suspicious activity reports that they have to notify. But I would say by and large, it's some of the larger scale fraud attacks that get the most attention and will be elevated to law enforcement. It's definitely not every fraud that occurs, and there's a lot out there. So what they do, a lot of it is for how they run their fraud groups. They want to track and label and report it so they can know where their weaknesses are and how they can get better. But that's not exactly always aligned with law enforcement. And I don't want to overspeak because I don't know exactly what the regulations are for each bank in the U.S. But it's a very large, it's a large scale problem. So it's not even feasible to be able to include law enforcement. There's not enough resources for every single case. But I guess getting back to the challenge of it is if you don't catch it, if you don't know how to label it and report it, then you're not going to have good statistics on it. And that's, I think, where banks would like to try and drive their efforts, which is improving, mitigating it and improving labeling it and being able to report it. And a good use case for that is the UK, which has had real-time payments for a while, and they've, I think, been on more of the forefront of fraud reporting, and they have a body called UK Finance, which reports on authorized push payment fraud, and they actually have some pretty good stats. I think it's tough to be representative of, all scams and authorized push payment fraud, but they at least have a handle on the scale of the problem, where in the U.S. we have what consumers report, reporting agencies, but as I mentioned, that's underreported. And we have, numbers here and there from banks, but we could all do a better job of consolidating those numbers and bringing those numbers together to get a better handle on how big this problem is.
Last year, the FBI said that they received a little over 600,000 reports, but at the same time, they're throwing numbers around like that there were about 30 million victims of various forms of scams in the United States. So, and we're seeing similar numbers come out of different analysis from cybersecurity companies and the like. And the curious thing is, the FBI and SCARS, although SCARS did it first, but the FBI, generally speaking, talks about a number between 3 and 5% of victims will report. And then, ironically, even in the case of BEC schemes, businesses substantially underreport. Well below 50% will report the crimes. Most of them will just eat it because of fear of embarrassment, undermining their corporate credibility, and also challenges with their shareholders. But based upon what we've seen in 2020, there's a sense, and I don't know whether you see this as well, that our estimates of reporting may be substantially less than what we thought it was, that it may actually be around 1 or below 1%. What do you see out there in your world with regard to that?
It's so hard to put a percent on it. I think I can just validate that it's underreported, and that doesn't take too much digging when you understand, just think logically about, how many people would actually report, being manipulated into sending money to somebody. Those types of scams, it doesn't, just a lot of people won't report that. So it's definitely low. I think more of what I focus on is when I, working with FeatureSpace, helping to provide technology to institutions to help them prevent this and then be able to report it better. From an about fraud standpoint, probably educating people and working with other organizations like yourselves to educate people about the issue out there, because that's part of the issue. You can have, you can have banks and institutions do all of their very best measures to track and detect these, but we need to educate people in a way that they'll actually listen and understand and kind of raise awareness, so they'll be less susceptible to these scams. The ones where they're going in and logging in and sending money out of their account. So
exactly.
And then the more, obviously it's a cyclical thing. So the better education you get, the better technology you get, the better you can report it, the better you can understand the problem, and then kind of allows you to invest in more technology, invest in more education. And I think we're just, we're kind of at the forefront of this. I think people know what goes on. I talk to my parents, my loved ones, and people know what goes on. I think it's just continuing to ring that bell, trying to reach organizations, yours that help victims. I was talking with a guy named Gabriel Friedlander who runs a company called Wiser, which is technology to educate people about security issues. And he has cool, engaging videos that are 1 minute long and about what our attention spans are. So it's like maybe we can reach them that way. What doesn't reach people at all is emails saying look out for this, and this, which looks like a blanket email that they send to everybody and people don't open or they delete, and it just doesn't resonate with people. Now, I'm not saying all individuals from different generations will want to hop on and watch a video or a TikTok or something, that I do think are cool ways to engage people. I think we can engage people on social media and educate them on platforms like TikTok. That's another conversation. But I think that's for certain generations, and then other generations need other ways. I think Brett speaks with AARP and that organization and how they can reach certain people. So it's education is not a simple thing, because you're talking to different people that learn in different ways and are digitally connected or not digitally connected. But I will say I really like the things Gabriel is doing. I think he's it's a way to reach certain people, and I do think it's effective.
Going back for a moment to resources, we both recognize that there are not enough resources to meaningfully address this problem. Europe is far in advance of the United States in that regard, and I think in the last year we've lost resources at the consumer level, but fortunately, the FTC has really upped their game, and we've recently become a formal partner of the FTC in criminal reporting. So we're directly wired into the Sentinel system with the FTC. But there seems to be this vicious circle that we all deal with in one way or another, which is that the underreporting results in a lack of awareness, because government can only report on what they actually factually know. So if they don't know what the magnitude is really like, then they're not in a position to allocate appropriate funds and resources to tackle the problem. So it becomes a spiral in effect. Do you see that from your side as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same business case issue that banks and other financial institutions have. You need to be able to make a business case to buy technology, to invest in resources to stop the problem. If you can't quantify that, your boss, senior leaders are not going to get behind the initiative. It's just hard. Now, there are some more progressive thinking people who can see the fraud, you can articulate the fraud trends on the horizon, invest in the technology, and proactively stop it. But that's really hard. And the government has the same issue. How are they going to allocate funds if you can't articulate the problem? So it is that issue. I think one of the good things that the Federal Reserve has done is they put out a fraud classifier model a year or two ago, and that splits up some of these payment frauds into unauthorized, more of your account takeover, and then some of more of your authorized, your scams. And so it's a framework to try and encourage institutions to adopt this, to when you have your fraud happen, break it up into these different buckets, label it, and then you can report on it. But that's, it's a good framework. And then it's how do you operationalize that amongst many, many different banks, community banks, large banks, different FIs. So that's, in the U.S., we are at such a larger scale than, the UK. I mean, they have a big financial system there, and we have how many more banks here? So it's not simple, but I do like to see that the Federal Reserve is trying to tackle this. They have people focusing on things like synthetic identity fraud and other different fraud use cases. So there's some movement being made there, but it is challenging to make a business use case, and you can go government, public, private when you don't have the stats and the awareness. So it's like a chicken and the egg thing. And I think we're getting to, like, when you think of consumers, I think they mainly think of fraud as like credit card fraud, and that's not so bad, and you get your money back, and there's a formal dispute process, and there's challenges in it, plenty of challenges. But then when you get into accounts being taken over and the liability, basically, are you responsible for money you willingly get scammed into sending out of your account? It gets much more confusing, and it gets a lot harder for consumers to understand what they're responsible, for banks to understand what they're responsible. And it's just the age that we live in, and it's probably less about pointing the liability is not my fault, it's your fault, and trying to figure out how we can get solutions to this, how we can get education, how we can get technology. And that's where we're at right now. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Do you think the UK has that largely worked out through their voluntary agreements with the financial institutions, and now they're talking about making those voluntary agreements codified in law? I
don't think so. I think they're trying to think proactively with the contingency reimbursement model that you're talking about, where they're able to reimburse more scam victims, but that is a challenge in itself. So it's, how do you get all banks, consistently following the reimbursement model and reimbursing victims consistently? I don't know enough about that process to speak too deeply into it, but I know that there's still plenty of challenges within the contingency reimbursement model. So even when you're taking steps maybe from a regulatory standpoint to try and address this problem with something like this, it isn't that simple. I think it's good that they're thinking of how they can help it, but I think as you probably dig more into the model, and it's very new too, so it's any type of thing is going to have its kinks worked out and understand where it's effective and where it's not effective. From what I hear, there's still some work to be done, but it's good that they're trying to think of some ways to address it.
And by the way, anyone who's listening, you had done a short article that we thought was very concise and brilliant, The True Cost of Scams, which is on our romanscamsnow.com website. If anyone wants to look it up, you gave us permission to reprint it, and I appreciate that tremendously. So we're coming up close to the halfway point now, and what I thought might be useful is just for a few minutes, perhaps you could offer your advice for individuals, especially since individuals are listening to our podcast, ways in which both they can protect themselves, try to avoid account takeovers and other forms of financial manipulation, and also perhaps your insights on interacting with their financial institutions, both upon discovery of a scam or some kind of unauthorized transaction, and really longer term to try and go back and obtain redress.
Yeah, so a number of things there, starting with things you can do. I think the unsettling part is that your information is out there. Brett talks about this. If it hasn't been compromised, it will at some point. There's things you can't control, and that can be very unsettling. But we live in a digital age where you're doing appropriate management of your finances and every store you interact with and online, and still your information will be compromised because that's just how you have to live. So things you can control is what the information you give up. So being manipulated into clicking on something or giving up information or potentially logging into an account and sending money to somebody that you potentially don't know or is not safe. I think that's probably the biggest win from a consumer standpoint, is being vigilant in that regard. It's some of them are very obvious, and you don't need much education to understand that email doesn't look good, that phone call is suspicious. But just know that it can happen to a lot of people when you don't expect it, when you're busy, when you're emotionally tired, and that's something that you can control and that you can be more vigilant about. And that if you feel you're very well educated, as you become more educated, educate family members about it. It can happen to anyone, but definitely vulnerable populations are ones to help out with, because they are vulnerable to some of these scams. I would say if you have fraud occur, there's a number of different things. If it's a card-based fraud, something where you can contact the merchant or file a chargeback dispute with your bank, that's the course to go. If it's card-based, there's almost every credit card, I believe, has a 100% chargeback coverage, so you can dispute it and you'll get your money back, assuming it's a legitimate dispute. There are some people who have friendly fraud where they pretend that they've have fraud on their card, and obviously that's not what you want to do. And then there's anything with your bank account and having your account taken over or scammed. You need to reach out to your bank. You need to make sure that you're reaching out to the proper number. So find a verified number to your bank. Some people will try and scam you saying you've had fraud at your account. This is your bank calling. We need to help you out. So you should be the one reaching out to them on a verified number and reporting it to them as soon as possible. And that's and following their instructions. Did I miss anything that you asked?
No, that's great. I know, PJ, you have to leave in about 5 minutes, so let me throw it back over to Debbie Montgomery Johnson and give you the opportunity to ask the final questions of PJ.
Well, I wanted to thank you, PJ, for being our guest today. It's such an important thing to raise awareness of what's happening. And as you were saying, as far as the reporting goes, people think that it's not ever going to happen to them. And we're not preventative in nature. We want to fix, like you were talking about that quick pill. We want a pill to fix things. We don't want to exercise to prevent. And so I've found in the last few years, there's a lot of work out there on cybersecurity from the mechanical side, but to have the victim side too, to understand the impact of the fraud on an individual is really important. And until someone either has a mother or father or a sister that's been involved, they may not take it as seriously as we think they should. So I appreciate you working with us and getting the human side of this too. So thank you so much. And if people would like to get a hold of you, how can we do that?
Yeah. So well, there's a number of ways. The website is About Fraud, so it's info@aboutfraud.com. That'll go to a general mailbox, or you can use my email. I don't know why I'm pj@about-fraud.com. So that's a good go-to. LinkedIn, I'm active there, so I'm open to chatting, a lot of the time. So,
PJ, if opportunities come up in the future, don't hesitate to consider, if you have engagements with financial institutions and there is a gap within that institution and they're open to the idea, we're happy to step up and help organizations become more scam victim aware in both their processes and their interactions with customers, to help advise them on the things to look for, the psychological factors, and how to communicate with victims more effectively to maintain those healthy client-customer relationships.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. I think that's something that would be interesting as people are going through this. It's really tough on the victims to try to get their perspective on what they're going through while you're a financial institution trying to look out for what you're going through from a business standpoint. So it's not fun for anyone. And I think too often it's the victim versus the bank. But the victim's going through a lot of stuff that they don't want to happen. The bank's going through stuff where they didn't want this to happen, and ultimately the person who scammed them is the real a-hole in all this. Excuse me, but that's so let's realize who the bad guy is, and if we can empathize with each other's perspectives, that would help. So I'll keep that in mind, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you, PJ, for being my guest today. This has been Dr. Tim McGinnis. I'm the Managing Director of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams. You can reach me at contact@againstscams.org. Our website address is againstscams.org. Please report all cybercrimes to anyscam.com. And to learn more about scams, visit romancescamsnow.com. So at this point in the show, I'll turn it over to Debbie Montgomery. Thank you, PJ, and we appreciate so much you being on the show with us today.
This episode has been sponsored by BenfoComplete.com, a vitamin supplement company that supports happy and healthy hands and feet for those with neuropathy. If you or anyone you know struggles with the pins and needles or numbness in their hands and feet, check out our benfotiamine products at BenfoComplete.com and use the special code STANDUP for a 5% discount on your purchase. Again, thanks everybody for being here today. Go to my website, thewomanbehindthesmile.com, for additional information and resources. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, watch the replays of these shows, and have a great day. Thanks very much for being here. Bye now.